Who hasn't heard of King Arthur's mystical realm of Camelot, Excalibur, the magical sword, and Arthur's quest for the Holy Grail? The king's life is a kaleidoscope of chivalry, magic, love, and betrayal, and scientists have finally found the body of King Arthur in this cave. We will finally find out who Arthur really was and whether Merlin, the most famous wizard of antiquity, existed in real life. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table have achieved a fame that goes far beyond British history and mythology. The whole of Europe is now familiar with his figure and his legend of glory and tragedy. Arthur Pendragon's life has been passed down as a magical and heroic fable, and today we ask ourselves what was reality and what was pure fiction. Did the ruler really exist, or is he a mere fairy tale character? At the heart of Arthur's kingdom was the Round Table, a symbol of equality and brotherhood, where his most loyal and brave knights sat. These knights were already legendary in Arthur's time. They had unusually free rights, and Arthur saw them as more than just servants or feudal lords. For the ruler, names such as Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, and Sir Galahad were not only warriors and guardians of justice, but also protectors of the weak, embodiments of the highest chivalric virtues and friends. Names like Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, Excalibur, and Merlin are familiar to every schoolchild today. The stories of goodness, wisdom, magic, and justice are more relevant today than ever before. Nevertheless, Arthur's life also had its dark side. As a young man, he unwittingly fathered a son with his own half-sister, Morgana, as part of a pagan ritual. Arthur's wife and great love, Queen Guinevere, was involved in a forbidden love affair with Sir Lancelot, and finally it was Arthur's own son, conceived in incest, who brought him down out of hatred. King Arthur really did exist. The question of King Arthur's true identity has haunted historians for centuries. Today, we can say with great certainty that the Arthurian legend is a mixture of myth and history. Historians have almost unanimously come to the conclusion that the legend is rooted in real events of the 5th and 6th centuries AD. As is so often the case, the story continued to evolve over the centuries and was repeatedly reproduced with slight changes and given literary form. Nevertheless, the real historical identity of King Arthur remained uncertain for a long time in this exciting search for the truth. Today, we have well-founded historical sources that mention Arthur, with the oldest of these sources dating from the later 9th century. As you can see, several centuries have passed between the real events in the 5th and 6th centuries and the oldest surviving writings, and that certainly provided plenty of room for retellings, fiction, and plenty of pathos. It is assumed that Arthur Pendragon was an army commander who fought 12 victorious battles against the Anglo-Saxons around the year 500 AD. Later, the exploits of the real commander and king may have merged with various Celtic legends. Motifs from the Arthurian legend appear in a slightly different form in much older legends. In the late 5th century, British refugees who fled from the Anglo-Saxons to the mainland in what is now Brittany brought the legends and oral traditions of a victorious king from the island to the mainland, so that legends and stories became intertwined there. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the fugitive Britons, who had meanwhile mixed with the Celts, returned to the island, and the Arthur legend became a national epic. The classic form of the story of Arthur, his kingdom of Camelot, and his magical sword and sorcerer comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth, a poet who wrote down the legend in his Historia Regum Britannia around 1135. What hardly anyone knows is that the Round Table and the magical realm of Avalon only came into the story much later in the rhyming chronicle A Roman de Brut by the Anglo-Norman poet Wassi. Did Arthur possess the Holy Grail? When it comes to legends and truths, myths and religion overlap. The legend of the Holy Grail links the historical figure of King Arthur with one of the most important symbols of Christian mythology. The Holy Grail, often depicted as a chalice, was supposedly the vessel in which the blood of Christ was collected on the cross. In the later version of the legend, the search for the Grail becomes one of the central questions for the Knights of the Round Table, for whoever possesses the Grail is said to revel in eternal wealth and eternal provision on earth. In the Arthurian legend, the Grail is often described as a mysterious, elusive object that can only be found and obtained by the most worthy. Just as the magical sword Excalibur can only be drawn from the rock by a noble with a pure heart. Arthur himself does not directly take part in the quest in the story, but his knights are the main protagonists in this quest. Chivalry emerged and flourished with the Crusades, and the virtues of Christianity are closely linked to chivalry. However, it is still not entirely certain whether the historical Arthur was already a Christian or a pagan. Arthur's entanglements and connections to Avalon, as well as pagan motifs in the oldest sources, tend to suggest that Arthur was not a Christian, and the Grail legend certainly came much later. It is said that Crusaders brought the Grail from Jerusalem to Europe, and it was then probably attributed to the legendary King Arthur or his knights. Some mystics claim that the Grail is kept safe by descendants of the wizard Merlin on the mystical island of Avalon. Excalibur, the magical sword. When it comes to Arthur, Excalibur, the mystical sword, is of course a must. Merlin, the wizard who served Arthur's father in the original saga, is a key figure in the story. In a time of great unrest and war, Merlin conjured the magical sword into a stone, and no one was able to take it, until a new king of true courage came along. Arthur is not consciously born as the king's son at first. Merlin must first find the rightful heir to the throne, and Excalibur is the key artifact. Many noble men tried their luck in vain, but the sword remained unshakably anchored in the stone until young Arthur arrives and hears of his destiny as future king via the sword. Excalibur is more than just a weapon. It is a symbol of royal power and legitimacy, a sign of divine favor. In some versions of the legend, Excalibur is given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake. With the sword, and guided by Merlin's wisdom, Arthur becomes a just and dignified king. He unites the torn land, founds the Round Table, and under his rule, Camelot and the entire kingdom, known at that time, experience an era of peace and justice. The Arthur legend as a secret code. If you love mysticism and the hidden truths of this earth, then you are surely familiar with the idea that ancient legends or even the Bible are in fact magical codes. The legend of Arthur contains a wealth of symbols and images that can take on a whole new meaning when viewed from a different angle. Let us first look at the famous sword Excalibur, which is drawn from a stone. This motif could be interpreted as a symbol of divine legitimacy and the right to rule. The drawing of the sword from the stone should not only be seen as a physical act, but also as a spiritual one. Behind the image is the idea that true power and authority come from a higher, divine source, and that only a few special people on earth possess similar divine powers. And it is precisely these who should be the leaders so that the fate of the earth turns out well. The Round Table of Knights was often seen as a symbol of wholeness. Each region sent a knight to the king's table. Sometimes there are 150 knights, and in other versions there are only 12 or 8. These number games were often associated with the mysteries of number mythology. The tablet is often described as round, and this could once again point to the symbol of wholeness. The Holy Grail is an object of inestimable spiritual value, and so to speak, the booty of the knights. Supreme spiritual purity and self-knowledge lead to the ultimate understanding of this world and union with the divine. The tragic love between Lancelot and Guinevere is difficult to interpret in this context, as is Arthur's fate in fathering his only child with his half-sister. The illegitimate son brings the father down. Did Arthur's purity and divinity not help him in the end? Or do these dark aspects represent the very challenges we all have to face on Earth, whether noble or wise or not? The relationship between Guinevere and Lancelot is interpreted as a test for King Arthur, and the battle between father and son as the eternal play of forces between good and evil. In the Christian tradition, the story is often associated with the temptations of personal desires and moral failure, both of which can have serious consequences for the greater good. Avalon, the magical island in the lake, is interpreted as a place between worlds, symbolizing the immortality of ideals and the hope of renewal. The severely wounded Arthur is brought there, and legend has it that the noble king will one day return from there, and with him the principles of justice, honor, and courage. Arthur's body is buried near Camelot. The search for the actual existence and whereabouts of King Arthur and his legendary court of Camelot has long been unsuccessful. Despite intensive research and numerous speculations, there was little concrete evidence, but many theories and suppositions about the possible locations. Every conceivable source was consulted to identify Camelot. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the author of the original Arthur manuscript, named the Welsh village of Caerleon, near Newport, as the residence of King Arthur. However, the name Camelot is not mentioned in the original version. This only appears at the end of the 12th century in the writings of the French poet Chrétien de Troyes. Caerleon and the surrounding hills and caves were searched several times, and researchers used the latest radar technology to search the ground for evidence of a fortress or settlement. But the evidence was ultimately unconvincing. In 1542, Cadbury Castle and Colchester were equated with Camelot. Colchester was called Camulodunum in Roman times, from which Camelot may have later developed. However, just as many suitable references have been found at Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, the village of Carlisle, in Dinas Bran, and the Welsh ruins of Vericonium. And even in Winchester, there have been references to the existence of Camelot. Subscribe now and look forward to many upcoming video hits.